Hi, and welcome to video presentation number 6 for our Introduction to Film class. This presentation is on the horror genre. What is the horror genre? It's impossible, really, to come up with a definition that encompasses all the films that some of us may consider to be horror, exclude those we may not consider to be horror. But in this presentation, we'll talk about some important subgenres of the horror genre, we'll talk about some important visual styles, and we'll also talk about tendencies that most horror films share. The great film scholar Linda Williams argues that horror is a body genre. That is, one of the most important things about horror is the effect it has on our body. Now, she has a chart in her really important early 1990s essay on film bodies that there are various genres that elicit literal, visceral, physiological responses from us. She talks, for example, about melodrama, soap operas that elicit emotion and ecstatic woe from us that often make us cry. Pornography is another one, another genre that's designed to elicit a physical reaction from us. And then finally, there's horror. We feel ecstatic violence, as she says on the chart that's on the PowerPoint slide here. We shudder. We're shown blood. We respond in this kind of like horrific, oh my God kind of way on an almost molecular level. And I think that's one thing we can say that most horror films acknowledge. That is, they are designed to scare us, literally inside of our bodies. We can also say that the horror film is greatly indebted to German Expressionism, itself a subgenre of horror film, for its visual style. Marcel talked a little bit about what German Expressionism was when defining film noir, but let me just talk a little bit about how the mise-en-scène of German Expressionism goes on to influence, particularly, American horror. The German Expressionist movement is defined by wildly stylized mise-en-scène, geometrically absurd sets and architectures, exaggerated shadows, stark contrast between light and black, designs painted on walls and floors to represent light, shadows, and objects, etc. That is, it's a shadowy, dark, and dislocated, non-realistic genre that again is designed to elicit those shudders, those feelings of the uncanny in our body. And the performance is often an extension of the mise-en-scène too. Actors are dominated by the set and they move through the pools of shadow and the strange perspective lines of German Expressionism with unnatural grace and jerky movements. From some of the earliest horror films, we remember how, let's say for example, Dracula pulls his cape over his face, or the way the Frankenstein monster lumbers through these dark and shadowy worlds that German Expressionism helps to create. The interesting thing about German Expressionism, of course, is it doesn't remain German for long. In 1933, Hitler's Nazi Party comes to power in Germany, and the sort of decadence and horror that is encoded in the idea of German Expressionism is contrary to the way Der Fuhrer wants to present Germany to the rest of the world. And so a number of craftspeople who are involved in the idea of creating German Expressionism actually leave Germany because there's no room for their art there anymore, and they come to America, where they bring their kind of shadowy styles and their creepy stories with them. And who better to convey the idea of a point of view of a world gone mad, a horrific world, than the emigres from the Aryan-run Germany of the 1930s. And as Marcel pointed out in his video last week, this idea of a world gone mad extends not only to horror films, but also to the kind of urban jungles and mistrustful detectives of film noir. One of the key figures in horror is the idea of the hybrid monster. According to Noel Carroll in his book, A Philosophy of Horror, the idea of the monster in the horror film is something that straddles cognitive categories that we usually think of as being mutually exclusive. So, for example, a zombie is both someone who is alive and dead, right? A werewolf is someone who is both human and animal. And even sometimes in horror films, there's a kind of misogyny and fear of gender transgression where we have monsters who are literally male and female as well, right? Think about Norman Bates in Psycho or Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. But this idea of the hybrid monster is designed by horror filmmakers to help us to straddle those cognitive categories and seem kind of uncanny and disturbing to us because we can't easily categorize where they fall in any sort of natural scale. And of course, these hybrid monsters appear in all kinds of different subgenres that exist in the horror film. So for example, according to Jason and Kimberly, there are certain traits of the zombie film that we see play out across all kinds of zombie narratives, whether they be 1940s zombie narratives, whether they be the George Romero cycle that began with Night of the Living Dead in 1968, or whether it be The Walking Dead, which is, I just heard, is going off the air next season. It's been on for 11 seasons, and we can see the same traits appear over and over again. A small group of survivors in an apocalyptic world, the dead piling up against closed doors trying to get in, vast numbers of mindlessly shambling bodies, the worldwide totality of the zombie apocalypse. The idea that the humans, the surviving humans, because they revert back to their sort of fight or flight mode, are more dangerous than the zombies turn out to be. The threats of raids from competing survivor groups as humans struggle for finite resources. And finally, the best plans and preparations are never enough to stop the zombie horde. And so this is a subgenre that has very specific traits in it, right down to sort of visual images of piles of bodies and shambling zombies that we come to expect when we watch zombie films. Slasher films, which take off really in the 1970s, which have precursors that come earlier, we have a monstrous, uncanny killer. We have a terrible place that the monsters inhabit, a Leatherface and his family, and the horrible cannibalistic feast in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for example. We have weapons that don't kill remotely, right? A slasher film never has a monster that kills with a gun. They need to be close to their victims. They need to be tactile. There needs to be an invasion of personal space, which contributes to the feeling of eeriness and the feeling of fear that you experience when you watch a horror film. Sexualized victims, that is, there are often analogies drawn between the sort of murder of the serial killer and a kind of sexualization of the murder, where the murder becomes a metaphor for sex. And then finally, and perhaps most interestingly, you have audience identification with a male-female character. In her pioneering work on slasher films in the early 1990s, Carol Clover argues that the central character of the slasher film is in fact not the monster. It is the final girl who is being stalked by the monster, who we identify with and we root for in the context of watching the film. And Clover applies that to charges of misogyny against the horror film, saying that if these films are so misogynist, then how come the people who go to see these films, primarily young males, experience some sort of catharsis, some sort of pleasure by identifying with a main female character? It is a way to sort of correct some of the earlier sort of LGBTQ phobia of the idea of the hybrid monster, by saying that much of the pleasure of watching slasher films is embedded in boys pretending to be girls. One progenitor of the slasher film is Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's famous film from 1960, where we identify with two women in the film, Marion Crane, who is murdered 40 minutes into the film, and then her sister, who goes to the terrible place of Norman Bates and his family in order to find out what happened to her sister. Finally, the most dominant subgenre of 21st century horror here in America is torture porn, defined as a genre of horror films in which sadistic violence is a central aspect of the plot, often to the detriment of the story. Torture as spectacle. A good example of that is the entire Saw franchise, where part of it is just to see people being tortured and distressed by extreme circumstances, a bear trap that's timed to go off attached to their heads, for example. There are other films made from other countries, too. I'm thinking particularly of France's 21st century brutal horror films like Inside or Martyrs. But this idea of torture as spectacle, we can say a couple things about that. One is torture porn is very controversial. I mean, just the very name was given to it by a cultural watchdog who believed that there was something very disquieting about us watching these, arenas of horror, these atrocity exhibitions where people were being tortured, taking horror films to a new and perhaps morally disturbing level. Second is the idea of torture as spectacle, almost independent of the narrative, sort of bits and pieces of embedded cinema of attractions within the narrative of the films, where that is really the reason why people watch them. Again, asking the moral question, why do we find ourselves so interested in watching horror films that are so cruel? But this is a quick overview of some major concepts of horror films. And in our next video presentation, we'll put horror films within the context of the life cycle of a genre, regardless of what genre it is. Thanks.